Go deeper. Make it quick inside. She gasped. The rancher broke the curse. Found hope. Zebardastia lower ziad a curiosity-driven hook. Bilkul clean grammar. Zero repetition. Exact 300 words. Dry willow held its breath when Clara Vayne stepped from the coach. 25. Shoes powdered with gray dust. She pressed her palm over the tarnished copper ring that never warmed. The sky had the color of old tin. Wind combed grit through porches. Cards hung mid-air in the saloon doorway. A boy froze with a broom. Somebody whispered. Same ring. Another voice. Vayne. The last slice of sun nicked the copper. And a faint thrum answered. Felt more than heard. Like a moth inside a jar. Clara forced a smile. I'm here for records. The word records seemed to startle the street. A door clicked shut. The telegraph clacked once. And then again, repeating the same dash and dot. An old man by the trough raised a finger, shaking. It was buried, he muttered. We sealed it. Don't you hear it calling? His gaze slid to the field beyond the churchyard, where a splintered cross leaned into the wind. Hands closed around Clara's arms. Rope scraped. Her satchel spilled. A brittle photograph skittered face down. The back stamped with a dry willow postmark dated the year she was born. She didn't own such a photo. The ring cooled further. From somewhere, maybe the wind. A whisper threaded through. Go deeper. Make it quick inside. They dragged her across stubble, lanterns jittering. Someone poured a circle of salt. It has to be done before full dark. A woman said. Before it digs back out. The shovel man marked a patch of ground still raw earth the color of dried blood. He started to dig. On the third strike the metal rang against something hollow. The soil trembled. Clara's ring answered with a sickly flash. And suddenly every dog in town began to howl. What do you think they unearthed with her family name etched on it? Clara Vayne had imagined Nevada as a map of light. Not a place where every glance felt like a nail-tapping bone. She left the city with a satchel of records. A thrifted camera, and the belief that a surname could guide her like a compass. When a forgotten postcard appeared in a courthouse file addressed to her mother and stamped Dry Willow long before Clara's birth, she packed, convinced that paperwork would open a door to roots. She arrived without any sense of the stories that had taken the town hostage. The street lay scoured by wind. Beyond the church, wheat fields sagged under gray dust. Ditches clogged. Mill veins stuttered. A splintered cross leaned on a rise. Rope coiled at its foot. She touched the tarnished copper ring and lowered her hand when whispers combed the porches. She did not know the ring's shape could tug the past up like a hook. Above the fields, a ridge held a still rider. Amos Creed, 60, lean as wire, watched from a dun mare brim shadowing a face scraped by weather and law. He had buried a daughter, the town called cursed, and a wife who could no longer endure a house that creaked like a shaft. The blast years ago had been filed as fate. Men said curses because negligence tasted like poison. Amos swallowed that taste until it hardened into silence. From his vantage, he saw coach dust, the crowd's careful swell, and the copper band flash the way it had once flashed on a small hand. He felt the rib-deep warning that never lied. In the street, Clara stood firm. She asked for ledgers and school rolls, speaking as if a counter stood between her and the world. No one answered. Faces stiffened into a single shape. Fear rehearsed until it looked like duty. A rope appeared. Salt arrived. Lanterns left hooks and drifted toward dust. The crowd did not roar. It folded around her as if guided by a shared map. Clara tried to step back, but hands gathered her sleeves and steered her toward the rise. Her satchel tipped. Papers skittered. A photograph she had never seen slid into dust, the back stamped with the town's mark. She glimpsed a child on a porch raising a copper ring like a coin before a boot crushed the image. Amos breathed through his teeth. Every part of the scene rhymed with a night he refused to relive. He had been handed hush money then, a bandage that never sealed the wound. He had helped trace the salt circle because grief makes men follow lines drawn by others while company clerks welded a new lock on the gate. He had kept still and called it survival. Between the church and the field sound thinned until only the telegraph ticked. A mother covered a child's ear. A deacon muttered that light dies faster here. Clara's pulse drummed where the rope would soon bite. She kept her voice even, saying she wanted records. Not the resurrection of fear. Her words fell flat. The procession climbed a narrow track through rattling stubble. Wind combed grit through skirts. The barren rise opened. The cross threw a bent shadow across tamped earth pale as ash. Rope lifted. Knots took rough wood pressed her back. The ring cooled as if the metal had its own breath. She asked for an explanation. The crowd breathed as one. Then an old man murmured that the ring calls back what the ground refuses to keep. No one spoke accidentally. No one said ledger. Amos shifted along a ledge where rock peeled in thin plates and counted lanterns, hands, angles and steps. Inside, shame gnawed like a small persistent animal. He had signed once when he should have shouted. He had watched a ribboned dress descend a porch and never return. He had taught himself to mend fences and sleep with rifle oil in his mouth. Now his eyes found the only task left. Clara drew breath against the rope and said her name, then added that she had come for dates and titles and a strand of connection, promising to leave quietly if shown where to look. Her voice skimmed the salt line and vanished. A man with a jagged scar set a shovel tip on the pale mound near the post and asked if all was ready. A murmur answered. He drove the blade down. A wrong note rose. A bowl tapped by a spoon. Lantern light crowded closer. A woman sprinkled more salt until the circle shone like frost. Clara searched the sky for color, and found only a flat sheet that promised nothing. Gravel clicked on the ridge, but the watcher stayed a shape. Amos held still, knowing how quickly panic spreads when a rider moves too soon. He needed one crack of doubt. He listened. A small rushing sigh moved inside the soil. People drew back and then leaned in, captives of their own terror. Amos's thoughts tightened into a cord. Truth without action is another story. He brushed the rifle, checked the chamber by touch, and told his mare to wait. He remembered his wife's last morning, hands finding work that did not need doing, eyes refusing windows. He remembered the paper he burned, the invoices he should have carried to the sheriff, the faces of men who did not want any sheriff involved. He remembered the porch and the underground thunder. He let the memories pass, leaving only the clean angle of choice. He weighed flight against duty, then felt duty outrun fear like a horse finding open ground. If he stayed still, the town would script the same ending and call it protection. He would not permit that echo. Not again, ever. On the rise, the scarred man struck again. The ground yielded a little. Someone whispered that it was starting. Clara felt the cross shudder. She refused to cry and pinned her thoughts to practical things. The order of rooms in a clerk's office. The smell of envelopes. The weight of stamps. The way signatures loop. She told herself she would walk out later with facts. And facts would hold. The ring pressed cold into her finger in slow pulses. The crowd swayed with it. A boy peeked from behind a skirt, eyes bright with the question adults would not let him ask. Amos eased down, hooves placing softly on the shelves of stone. He thought of riding past and vanishing into gulches until the town forgot both ring and rider. He thought of charging through and taking wounds he could not afford. He chose a third line, the narrow one that breaks a pattern without breaking the people trapped inside. He would cut the rope, seize the girl, and make them hear. He would speak names buried under the word curse. He would drag ledgers into daylight and point to signatures. He would say his own out loud. The shovel rang a third time. Dust lifted and hung. Lanterns flickered as if breath passed over their wicks. A collective shiver traveled the ring of bodies. Amos tasted iron, the old flavor of the mine's dark. He squeezed the reins. The mare's ear flicked to shovel, then to breath. Dusk crawled down the ridge. Clara whispered one word, "Why?" and nobody answered. Amos slid the rifle free, and let the muzzle find the knot at her wrist in his mind, rehearsing the angle twice, then once more. He had failed once by standing still. He drew a breath that steadied his hands and pressed his heel. The mare stepped forward, carrying him out of the shadow into the town's line of sight. Now, it had to change. Lanterns wavered as the townsfolk drew a bright band of salt around the barren rise, each pinch tossed with a murmur meant as prayer and sounding like dread. Clara's wrists burned where coarse rope held her to the splintered post. Wind driving grit across her mouth until breath rasped. The tarnished copper ring on her finger flashing a cold, needling light whenever a flame dipped. She asked for records and names, begged to read whatever they hid, but answers broke into scraps of warning, rehearsed lines that kept panic alive while pretending to soothe. A deacon scuffed the circle with a boot and traced it again, muttering syllables learned long ago, the kind that people repeat when silence frightens them more than superstition. A mother tucked a child behind her apron and pressed 2 fingers into the air as if drawing a shield. Beside a dented lamp, a bowl of salt sat with a spoon stabbed upright like a flag on claimed ground. The wind climbed out of the flats and prowled through dead wheat, paper-dry stalks giving a restless whisper. From the darker slope a single rider watched without moving. Amos Creed held to the shadow where juniper broke the gusts. His old rifle balanced along the saddle, jaw tight, while thought pulled him 2 ways. One way led down trail to solitude and the lie that leaving would spare lives. The other cut straight through the circle and his own shame toward a choice that would end repetition. He counted lamps, hands and distances, building a map the way men do who expect trouble. The chant swelled, not quite hymn and not yet curse, a humming edge that climbed bone. Clara steadied her voice and asked for an elder, said she would copy ledgers, and promised to leave peacefully if they let truth breathe. Her words thinned in dust and went nowhere. A scarred man lifted the spoon and drew a second ring inside the first, then a third until the marks nested like seasons that would not conclude. Faces looked carved by the glow, afraid, determined, careful. A horse stamped on the slope, and Amos felt the question travel the rain. He whispered steadily and let the rifle rest while he measured fear against debt. He had kept quiet once, had believed that order survives if grief stays indoors. The mine blast had shredded that belief and left nights full of footsteps that never reached his porch. Tonight the town rehearsed the same scene, actors older, stage unchanged. Salt hissed when grit blew across the line and hands hurried to seal the breach as if earth itself had tried to speak. Clara felt the ring cool until it seemed to breathe on its own. It had been warm when her mother wore it on a string. Here, stories iced metal. She forced her lungs to pull harsh air and spoke to them as neighbors, asking them to see a traveler, not an omen. The plea touched faces lit from below and turned them to cliff masks. A boy peered around a sleeve at the ring, eyes huge, and slipped back when a hand pushed him. The scarred man tested the ground with a shovel tip, listening for the hollow note that had frightened even the bull. The wind gathered and came howling over the ridge, shouldering sand into the circle, bending smoke sideways, making the crowd hunch like a single body. Clara coughed, tasted metal and tried again. She said fear turns decent hands into blind tools. She asked how long they would kneel to a story that never answers. Several heads shifted, tiny motions like prairie dogs testing daylight. Amos saw that drift and held to it because small drifts move river. He pictured how the next minute could break. A wild shot, a trip, a fall on a stone. He pictured a cleaner minute, one warning, one cut knot, one fast dash. He also pictured the hard road, step into the ring and name the lie. The rifle felt steady, less weapon than lever if used with judgment. A thin voice from the circle asked whether the ring might be a keepsake rather than a key. Eyes smothered the speaker. A boot kicked the hole wider. Air rose from the split, smelling of wet timber and old coins. Clara's ring answered with a pale gleam and went dull again. She resisted the urge to tear it free. Surrender would confirm their tale and erase her right to ask. She kept it on, lifted her chin and said she had come to catalog facts, not people. Murmurs pricked the ring of bodies, and a few hands unclasped. Amos eased forward until the brush scraped the mare's chest. He drew breath, aligned the sight with the knot at Clara's wrist, and stilled the bead. Choice waited like a gate. He did not trust the town, yet he loved the land that raised them all, the creek under basalt, the coyotes that sang over sage, the winter stars that kept hard watch. He would not trade that love for quiet if quiet meant complicity again. Grit peppered his cheek. The sting steadied him. Across the circle, the deacon touched the bowl to his brow and whispered for protection, tenderness twisted by terror. Clara closed her eyes against the dust and let a whisper carry anyway. Have you ever felt trapped by others' fears? The words landed like a mirror. 2 women dropped their gazes, and a man shifted as though a muscle had cramped, though only thought had moved. The shovel struck wood with a dull thwack that made the child gasp. Silence pooled, a held breath running around the ring. Amos felt the seam of that pause and knew breaks like this either heal or tear. He stepped the mare 3 paces closer and let the town see him at last. A single rider at the edge of their drawing. Hissing rose. Not everyone joined. Clara watched his shadow stretch across the dust like ink, finding a path. The ring answered with a sick spark that crawled up the rope and died. The deacon rattled salt against the bowl's rim like sudden hail. A woman began a hymn, faltered on the second line because nothing in that tune matched the night. The digger cleared soil from a warped plank branded long ago, letters washed to ghosts. Breath held, Wind sank to a low moan. Lantern steady. Amos lifted the rifle, not as a promise of harm but as a boundary you could hear. His voice came level when he spoke at last, weathered to kindness by years and stripped of apology. No soul would be broken tonight for a lie. Clara found strength in that tone and matched it. She told the circle that truth does not require blood to prove itself. A few bodies leaned toward her, toward him, toward the crack in the story that had ruled their mornings. The line still held, though it no longer ran perfect. That hairline bend carried the beginning of a road. Dust swirled, prayers faltered and the copper ring burned cold. Within that faltering quiet, choice thickened, waiting for one act to tilt fear back toward daylight. Lanterns leaned into the dust and threw long trembling ovals across the rise, while the crowd tightened its ring, salt crackling under boots, rope creaking as Clara strained against the splintered post. A scarved woman lifted a small knife. The scarred digger gripped his shovel like a club. The deacon uncapped a tin of oil and swore that flame would cleanse what earth refused to keep. Grit rasped in throats. The odor of old ash mixed with iron and wind-blown wheat. A boy peered and vanished behind a sleeve. Murmurs knitted themselves into a chant that never quite found melody. Clara raised her chin and asked again for records and names, promising to leave if shown the truth. Replies arrived as fragments. Not now, not you. Not here. Salt hissed when the gusts drove granules over the bright line. Lantern glass breathed, then steadied. A match scratched. Someone called for tinder. Someone else told the digger to strike wood and wake what waited. The knife tipped toward Clara's sleeve. She held still. The tarnished copper ring caught a thin lick of light and flashed cold. Not hot, the way fear makes metal feel distant from skin. On the slope, Amos Creed watched without moving. One knee braced against the saddle, rifle laid along the horn, breath slow because speed had never saved anyone he loved. The mare stood patient as basalt. He read the ring of bodies the way ranchers read sky, measuring eagerness, dread and the hunger for a simple ending. He looked for the scene where panic might split and found it near the boy and the tired woman who still held her hymn book. He followed their eyes, mapped the gaps between shoulders, counted strides, and decided the first sound must cut terror without cutting flesh. Memory sent a tremor through his hands. A porch that never saw its child return, a shaft that breathed iron, a paper he should have carried to the sheriff. He pressed his fingers into the worn leather and let the tremor pass. Choice waited like a gate. Clara felt the rope bite as the ring tightened. She said her name. She said she came for dates and ledgers. She said she would step onto the morning coach with copies and silence. Answers did not change. Oil poured in a dark oval at her feet. The deacon lifted the tin and asked for matches again. The digger raised the shovel, tilted his head to hear the ground and smiled when a dull note answered. The knife rose a second time. Lanterns swam in dust and cast eerie halos on faces that looked carved by the glow. The crowd leaned as one body. A breathless hush held like ice. Amos slid the rifle to his shoulder, and sighted high, a palm's width above the cross. He pictured a burst that scattered lantern light, sent salt flying and emptied courage from the front ranks. He whispered steadily to the mare, exhaled slowly, and pressed the trigger. The shot cracked the night and hammered the ridge. Echoes rolled over the field like an iron drum. Lanterns jumped and rattled on wires. Oil tins clinked. Several villagers stumbled backward through their own circles and dropped their tools. The knife fell with a dull click. The boy screamed once and went quiet. As glass steady, another sound arrived. The long hush of people remembering breath. Clara seized that hush. She asked whether her death would heal a seam under the field, whether a rope ever altered weather, whether salt had ever taught truth to speak. Then, clear enough for every lamp to hear, she asked the only question that could puncture ritual. If she died, would the curse end? The words struck like rain on a dust-choked road. Feet stilled. Hands fell from their furious task. The deacon looked at the tin as if seeing what he held for the first time. The knife vanished into a pocket. The digger froze with the shovel on his shoulder, jaw set yet uncertain. The chant died. Silence. Real silence. Amos guided the mare from the shadow and rode downhill at a measured pace, claiming space with the steady weight of a man who had buried illusions and kept working. Hoofs found safe shelves through shale. Dust lifted in pale sheets around his boot. He stopped 2 strides from the salt and lowered the rifle until the barrel pointed at the ground. He said nobody would be harmed tonight. He said superstition had demanded too much already. He said he carried no quarrel with neighbors, only with a story that ate their sleep and devoured their judgment. The crowd parted a little more, an unconscious adjustment, as if a new map had been placed over the old one. Someone shouted that he had no right. Amos answered that the right begins when a lie threatens a living soul. He called Clara by name and promised to cut the rope when people put down blades. He told the digger to lower the shovel and stand clear of the post. He told the deacon to pocket the oil and hold the book that had taught him mercy long before terror taught him habit. Faces softened and tightened by turns. Fear does not yield at once. Yet the first layer cracked. Clara used that crack. She said she had found a postcard with a dry willow stamp from the year she was born and wanted to compare payrolls, burial lists and rail invoices. She said truth keeps weather, while myth keeps fire. She faced the ring and asked again, if she died would the curse end, or would it simply find another throat tomorrow? No mouth answered. Wind blew across the crossbar and made a low flute that sounded like grief. The ring gleamed once, a thin sickly glint, and went dull. The deacon stepped forward, trembled and withdrew. A mother pushed her child behind her and spoke a single word, enough soft as breath. Yet the shape of that word traveled farther than volume could carry. The knife hand vanished. The digger shifted his grip as if the tool had gained weight. Amos felt the moment holding like a skittish horse that might bolt or settle. He raised one palm, fingers open. He told them what he had learned too late. Fear wears a neighbor's face while hiding a ledger's teeth. The blast that took his family had been wrapped in talk of curses so men with contracts would never face reckoning. He did not speak names yet, but he let the truth walk to the edge of the light and stand where everyone could see its outline. He swung down from the saddle and let the reins drop. The mare stayed. He stepped to the salt and stopped just shy of the line. His voice lost its iron and found a steadier current. He said he would not watch the town repeat his worst night and pretend it was a rescue. He lifted the rifle by the forestock, offered it butt first to the deacon, then set it on the ground and slid it with his boot toward the man. The gesture landed harder than the shot. A breathy murmur moved around the ring, shoulders lowered, eyes watered in the cold. Clara's gaze met his and held. She asked for records once more and added a cleaving question that reached into every rib. What would you risk to stop a lie? The words struck like a bell. Several villagers looked at their hands as if surprised by what they carried. The knife was already gone. The shovel sank until its blade bit dirt. The oil tin disappeared into a coat. Amos took the last 2 paces, leaned and sawed through the knot at Clara's wrist with a small folding blade he kept under his cuff. The rope fell from one hand, then the other. He did not step inside the circle. He honored the boundary even while undoing its claim. He told Clara to breathe and keep still. He told the crowd that hearing could begin now that harm had stopped. A man in the rear cursed at weakness and reached for a hidden pistol, then froze when 3 neighbors touched his arm in the same second. The mare stamped and shifted her weight, ears flicking between breath and wind. Lanterns burned eerily and the shot smell still hung in the air, sharp as struck tin. Clara rolled stiff shoulders and kept speaking, careful to keep the calm that had found her in the hush. She said paperwork would tell the story better than fire ever could. She said ledgers do not scare easily. She said names deserve daylight. Elders glanced at one another with the dawning recognition that silence had an audience. It did not deserve. The circle did not break, yet it loosened. A path appeared without anyone deciding to make one. Amos gathered the rope and coiled it, then laid it on the ground where every eye could see the end. He straightened and faced the digger, the deacon and the mothers. He told them morning was near enough to borrow courage from it. He said panic would only buy another night of rumor. He said the town had a chance to choose light over habit. Wind rattled wheat. Dogs barked and fell silent. The field waited. Nobody moved to strike. The lanterns kept their haunted glow, but the sheen no longer promised harm, it promised witness. Amos turned his shoulder to the crowd and offered Clara a steadying hand. She did not take it. She stood without help and nodded once, not for defiance but for agreement. He accepted that answer and stepped back so voices other than his could carry what needed saying. The ridge swallowed the last echo of the warning shot, leaving only breath, rope on dust, and the faint metallic tick of a cooling cartridge somewhere in the grass. Amos kept his palm up until the murmur thinned, Then he crossed the salt and cut the last knot. Rope sliding from Clara's wrists with a dry hiss as lanterns rocked like uneasy moons. He faced the ring, rifle held by the barrel in a promise of restraint, and said the night would not claim another soul while he stood here. Footsteps faltered, the knife vanished. Oil tins slipped into coats, the shovel lowered without striking. He told them to go home, close shutters and let daylight test every story. A few obeyed at once, yet others lingered with stubborn dread, eyes fixed on the copper ring that glinted cold on Clara's finger. Wind pressed dust against lips and lashes, turning breath to rasp. Clara steadied herself, shoulders stiff, voice rough but clear as she asked for records instead of rituals. No answer came. Amos lifted the coil of rope, dropped it beside the post where all could see its harmless curve, and backed the mare toward an opening between the shoulders. He told Clara to walk when he moved. Someone barked a warning. Another reached a third thought better and stepped aside. They moved together, rider and woman, through the slackened ring, past a fallen lantern that ticked as its glass cooled. Amos did not look back. He raised the rifle and fired once into the empty sky. The crack rolled across wheat and sent that fragile nerve scrambling, leaving only hoofbeats, running steps and the rattle of dry seed heads. Clara kept pace beside the mare until the slope steepened and the ridge swallowed lantern light. At the crest, the wind thinned, and stars pricked through the gray. She climbed onto the cantle when he offered a hand. The mare leaned into the descent on the far side, hooves sure on broken stone. They did not speak until the town lay small as a handful of sparks and the flats gave way to sage and shadow. Amos aimed for a cut that curled along a dry creek, then followed a barely seen track toward a stand of juniper where a low roof waited. Smoke from a banked fire braided with the leather smell of bridles and old coats. A dog gave one warning bark and settled. He slid from the saddle, looped the reins over a peg, and helped Clara down, careful of rope burns that ringed her wrist. The cabin door opened on lamplight in plain order, an iron stove, stacked wood, a scarred table, a wall hung with bridles, a narrow bed and a trunk with a buckled strap. The air held cedar, smoke, grease and a faint sweetness from dried apples cooling on a cloth. He poured water, handed her a tin cup and set a folded shirt against the tender skin where fibers had bitten. She stripped grit from her mouth, drew breath without dust, and let the tremor in her hands run its course. Only then did she look at the ring and ask what it was beyond rumor. He leaned a shoulder to the door jamb, eyes on the stove as if the iron might judge him. He said the band had once been bright and small. He said a child wore it on a string because her fingers were tiny and proud. Clara turned the ring with her thumb, watching the dull gleam as if it could answer for itself. She asked whether the mine had taken his people. He nodded once, the gesture spare, the admission heavier than any pride. He told her a shaft had been driven too far too fast, and reinforced with wood that split like old bone. He told her a ledger had been doctored to keep the night quiet and the payroll steady. He told her grief had been wrapped in superstition until justice suffocated. She listened as though each sentence were a nail pulled from a warped board. Slow work, necessary work. He set coffee to boil, the pot old, the routine steady, the crackle of kindling like distant rain. She asked how the ring carried any of it. He said it did not. He said the band was a keepsake that became a scapegoat because metal cannot argue, and a story can be bent into a mask. He told her not to surrender her claim to questions. He said the town had given him silence for years and silence had never healed a single broken beam. She said she wanted names, dates, an accident report, a purchase order for cheap timber, any line that proved how fear had been trained to kneel before account books. He poured 2 cups and placed one within reach. He said he still had a journal that survived the blast because his wife kept it under flour in the pantry. He said it named foremen, shipments, and delays that never reached the surface office. He said it mentioned an inspector who vanished after writing a single page which the company never filed. She asked to read it at dawn. He told her dawn would do, though he wanted her to sleep first, because the mind breaks patterns better with rest. She shook her head and then nodded, indecision settling into acceptance as warmth reached her fingertips. She eyed the door and asked whether anyone would come. He answered that fear always tries, but the slope was steep, the dog listened well, and the ridge kept secrets for those who walked it with care. He moved to the trunk, undid the buckle, and lifted a ledger wrapped in cloth. He set it on the table without opening the cover. He said the ring was a gift meant for a birthday his child never reached. He said the town had tied that grief to a myth, because myth is easier to escort to bed than guilt. He said he had lived half alive since, tending fences, avoiding gatherings, speaking only to horses and she asked whether bringing truth into the open would tear him from that half-life or finish what sorrow had started. He said truth can cut or suture depending on the hand that holds it. He said her arrival felt like both danger and medicine. She looked at the band again and asked quietly, "Have you ever carried a past you didn't understand?" He did not smile. He said every day since the blast. She breathed out. Long. Something unknotted. Not relief. Not victory. Simply a loosening that allowed thought to move. She asked why he had fired into the sky instead of the ground. He said thunder teaches crowds to stop and listen, while dust makes them cough and run. She asked whether he believed in curses at all. He said he believed in negligence dressed as fate. He said he believed in men who hide behind stories when ledgers would damn them. He said he believed grief turns honest voices hoarse, until somebody steadies the room. She raised the cup, swallowed, and felt heat spread through a body stiff with cold. The cabin settled around them like a held breath let go. Ash ticked in the stove. Leather relaxed on hooks. He sat across from her and set a small knife on the table, the same blade that had freed her hands, not as a threat, as proof that rescue could be plain, not theatrical. She traced the cup rim and asked what came next. He said they would ride at first light to the mine office, carry the journal and ask the clerk who had signed a shipment nobody should have signed. He said they would read names aloud under the same sky that had just watched a crowd almost choose ruin. He said some would fight, some would flee, and some would be grateful for the chance to stop kneeling to a ghost. She touched the ring again, lighter now, not absolved, not accused. He nodded, stoked the fire, and checked the latch. He set the rifle where his hand could find it without thoughts of violence. The dog curled near the door and slept with one ear raised. He blew the lamp down to a low coin of light. They listened to the cabin breathe. Outside the ridge kept watch, and down in the flats, the town wrestled with a silence it had not held for years. Clara lay back without removing her boots and stared into the warm gloom, rehearsing the questions she would ask when daylight lifted the valley, then closed her eyes and finally slept. Night held steady while purpose gathered, patient, exact, ready to name what hid for so long. Dawn pressed pale light through the cabin window as the stove ticked and the dog lifted one ear. Clara rose, crossed the packed floor, and unwrapped the ledger Amos had kept beneath flour for years. A small book with blunted corners, cedar and smoke in its cloth. She opened it to a steady hand that believed ink could guard lives, dates, shafts, timber grades, bracing schedules, seep notes, warnings. A second hand crowded the margins with urgent lines about stress at 90 feet and requests for steel. A red pencil answered later, see procurement. A pasted scrap from a state inspector named a failed brace during a test swing, and urged review without delay. A greasy thumb had dragged across the signature, dulling the name to a blur. Clara turned the page to an entry dated 3 days before the blast. Oak shipped instead of hickory, knots stained over, wagons unloaded at dusk. A narrow column marked savings beside the same men scheduled for the brace line. At the bottom ran a sentence in a woman's firm script. Keep this under flour until law can see it. Do not let fear wear a holy mask. Next came a last leaf from the morning of disaster. Whistles out of rhythm, gas suspected, a hairline split in a support, then a blot where a pen had halted mid-stroke. In a margin, in later ink, someone had written a curse, and underlined it twice. The word lay over facts like a veil. Amos stood near the door with his hand on the latch, not guarding against her, guarding against memory, and watched while paper spoke with the blunt voice grief had never allowed him to hear in full. Clara lifted the tarnished ring to the light, let it gleam once and settle to ordinary copper, then rested it on the page that carried a child's name and a crossed-out birthday. The ring had been a gift, not an omen. An object cannot argue when a town decides it should carry shame. She read the names aloud: haulers, cutters, bracemen, the inspector who had come below first hour to prove a method, and felt the room change. Not safer, clearer. The dog rose, circled, and lay with its nose toward the door. Ash sighed in the stove. Juniper shadows brightened on the sill. Amos said he had opened those leaves only once after the burial and then hid them, because money had come with promises that quiet would keep neighbors fed. Quiet had fed guilt, not family. Clara slid a finger under a stitched fold and freed a hidden note in a third hand, almost certainly the inspector's. It named 2 foremen, and a procurement man who signed substitutions while condemning superstition from the pulpit on Sunday. At the bottom a line gave directions. If I do not arrive, ask for my report under the clerk's chairboard, where a split catches a thumbnail. She looked up. The ledger had turned a ghost into an address. Amos's jaw tightened and then he said the manager had stood on the steps after the blast, and told everyone that sin had walked among them wearing copper, and people desperate for meaning had believed it because meaning offered by an authority can feel like hell. He pointed to a page where deductions were penciled beside late payroll and said he had seen that exact arithmetic buried under sermon. Clara closed her eyes and saw the salt circle, the knife, the shovel, the lantern, glass breathing as fear inhaled and exhaled. Then she saw a porch, a ribbon, a bright ring on a string, and a father weighed by what was taken. When she spoke, steadiness carried her word. The ring would not leave her finger. It would return to its rightful story only when names wore sunlight and signatures lost their disguises. She asked whether anyone else had kept record. Amos said some burned, some traded paper for aid, some hid scraps in walls, and one widow stitched a list inside a quilt. He did not know whose hands still held which fragments. Clara folded the note, slid it into her jacket, tore a page of names for redundancy and wrapped the ledger again. She did not move away from the table. She let resolve anchor her feet and breath. Amos opened a small tin where his wife had saved buttons and a curl of their child's hair, set it beside the cloth-wrapped book without lifting the lid, and said the town had mistaken remembrance for sorcery, because blame is lighter to lift when you can point at metal. Clara touched the ring and felt only its simple cool, a circle with no appetite. She asked whether he could stand next to her when she spoke in the clerk's office. He said he could, though his hands might shake when he read a child's name. Hands can shake and still hold steady work. She poured water from the kettle and drank, steam clearing dust from her mouth and the taste of rope from her tongue. She set the tin cup down, took up her camera and made 2 careful photographs of the critical lines in case paper vanished under pressure. Amos almost smiled and said bad light had governed too long. Let the day be brighter. She mapped aloud the steps, clerk's desk, church minute book, mercantile tally, hauler tags, mine gate log, and finally the quilt with the hidden list, stitched where a palm warms at night. His eyes changed when she spoke the sequence. The look of a rider who sees a safe crossing where he had only seen a flood. He asked whether she feared returning to the field. She said fear traveled with her anyway, but fear would not be the driver or the map. She had a ledger and a voice. He cleaned his hands as if absolution could live in soap, dried them on a faded towel, put on a jacket that remembered rain better than luck, and took down a hat that had known winter stars. He saddled the mare, checked the cinch and brought her to the door. The dog stood and wagged once as if volunteering to witness. Clara slipped the ledger into her satchel beside the folded page and the inspector's note, slid the small knife into a pocket and looked around the cab. The air smelled of smoke and leather, but also of a calm that comes when work replaces dread. She asked whether he needed words before they left. He said wood had heard enough, only people needed hearing now. They rode out, hooves drumming a measured promise along the cut toward the flats, sage breathing bruised sweetness, shadows of clouds sliding across wheat that had bent all night under rumor. At the edge of town Amos reined in and said it felt like a stone had been lifted from a stream and the water had begun to speak in its old voice. Clara said water keeps records in grooves and people can too if they stop pretending grooves are curses. He nodded and urged the mare forward. Faces appeared at windows and doorways, wary, curious, less hard than last night as if sleep had sanded fear's sharpest teeth. They dismounted at the clerk's office. Clara placed the wrapped ledger on the counter, unknotted the cloth and opened it to the page with substitutions, the ink that had tried to hide its shame. Amos took off his hat and said the ring had been a birthday gift, and nothing more. Clara lifted the inspector's note and read the final line about the chairboard and the split that catches a thumbnail. The clerk stared, blinked and then looked toward the chair as if gravity had tilted beneath him. Outside wheat bowed to the wind and somewhere a bell rang once. Not doom, only morning naming what survived today. Clara and Amos reached the abandoned shaft by noon. Sage bending in gritty gusts. The mouth of the mine yawning like a cauterized wound ringed by splintered beams and rusty rail. Men stepped from the tailings berm with rifles level, hats low, boots dusted the color of ledger paper. At their center waited Silas Kane, elder by title and habit, jacket buttoned, cane planted, eyes steady as mortared stone. Amos tied the reins to a shattered post and helped Clara dismount, palm careful of her raw wrists. Silas tapped the rail, Metal rang once. That sound carries farther than reason. He said, you should have left our peace untroubled. Clara set her satchel down, unwrapped the flour-stained cloth, and opened the journal to pages inked with substitutions, warnings and an inspector's note about bracing. Peace never lived here, she answered. Only a story that hid names. Silas's men drifted to the flank. He eyed the copper ring on Clara's hand. Then Amos, you should be grateful for order, he said. What I preached kept neighbors fed. Amos studied the slope, counting rocks and distance. Order is honest only when it faces accounted causes, he said. Your order buried timbers under sermons. A trigger finger tightened. Clara lifted the journal high. Oak shipped instead of hickory, she read. Knots stained. Braces split. Gas suspected. Testing skipped to save coin. Foreman approving substitutions while the pulpit blamed metal on a child's hand. A rifle drooped a finger's breadth. Silas laid his cane across the rail. That book is grief talking, he said. Grief invents enemies. Clara slid out the inspector's slip and held it beside the ledger. A state seal endorsed this line, she replied. The report named a brace at 90 feet and ordered closure until reinforcement arrived. Your deacons called that paragraph gossip, and condemned a ring. Amos stepped half a pace forward. This ground knows the truth, he said. It has the weight of names pressed into ore carts. Silas lifted 2 fingers. Men closed in, boots grinding grit. The dog bristled. The mare tossed her head. Amos opened his hands. We leave with the journal after air moves through the lies, he said. No blood today, no more nights practicing panic. Silas's smile thinned. Return that ledger and ride away, he said. Otherwise the ridge keeps 2 more stories. Clara faced him squarely. Return what to whom, she asked. These pages belong to the dead and the living who wear their wages as scars. A guard lunged. Amos swept the barrel aside with his forearm, drove his shoulder into the man's ribs, and sent him sliding into talus. Another rushed. The dog tore cloth and bought 2 heartbeats. A third grabbed for the satchel. Clara stepped back, kept the journal high, and read louder like a sworn witness. Payroll deductions after the blast, she called. Widow allowances cut. Hazard bonuses cancelled. Parish collections steered to a relief fund managed by the same office that signed substitutions. Amos caught a wrist, twisted and kicked the rifle under the rail. Silas rapped a cane on steel. 2 more men came from behind a spoil heap, one with a chain, the other with a club cut from a shovel handle. Amos moved to the narrowest ground, forcing a single file. Chain swung. He ducked. Wood hissed. He checked the blow with his forearm, then kicked the clubber's knee. The chain carrier hesitated when Clara's words rose like a bell. Inspector M. Doyle, she read. Report filed. Clerk instructed to hide a copy under a split board that catches a thumbnail. Signed 3 days before the explosion. Silas Kane was present when the stoppage was overruled. The chain drooped. A curse rose and died without echo. Silas's jaw tightened. Paper can be forged, he said. Heat and fear make ink run. My sermons held the valley together. Clara crunched forward and held the book at arm's length. Your sermons turned negligence into ritual. They trained people to kneel to smoke and borrow language from mourning to hide ledgers. Silas signaled a man on the ridge. A muzzle edged above rock. Amos stepped to shield Clara. Eyes on the outline, calculating angles. Don't, he said. Hit me, you still face the book. Hit her, you face the valley. The ridge muzzle dipped. We brought names, Amos said. You brought shadows. Shadows don't hold. Clara continued. Shipment 37, she read. Oak approved by procurement head R. Voss. Side note about savings and a handshake from the pulpit. Braces failed. 12 men never came home. 1 girl never reached a birthday. Wind shifted. The mine exhaled a cool draft smelling of wet timber and coins. The dog whined and fell quiet. The clubmen sat, ribs heaving. Silas stepped, cane grinding gravel. You embarrass your dead, he said. They rest under a moral curtain I fought to sew. Amos's tone flattened. They rest under earth and numbers, he said. That curtain wraps your shame. Pull it down. A guard lifted his rifle, then let the barrel fall and stared at his hand. My brother died in that blast, he muttered. We never saw the report. Clara nodded and gave him a copy torn last night. Keep this, she said. Copy it again. Silas lunged for the ledger. Amos caught the cane, wrenched and snapped the shaft against the rail. The old man stumbled, coat flaring. You cannot prove motive, he gasped. A town needs a banner. I gave them one. They ate because fear walked in front. Clara lowered the ledger a fraction, voice gentler but edged. People ate, she said. But mothers starved for truth. Children learned to whisper over salt. A ring took the blame because metal keeps still. She set the book on the rail, pressed her palm to the cover and spoke to the valley. The curse is a mask, she said. The wound came from cutting corners. The survivor carries both. Silas sagged, chin dipping. Defiance crumbled. Rifles lowered one by one. The ridge muzzle vanished. The chain fell with a small clink and lay like a spent snake. Amos did not smile. He looked from men to Clara, then into the mine where dark air moved like a memory refusing to settle. We ride to the clerk next, he said. Then the church. Then every porch that nodded while sermons pointed at a child. Bring your copies. Silas tried one last posture. I did what was needed, he said. Chaos ruins towns. Amos answered without heat. Chaos already came, he said. You gave it scripture. Clara closed the journal and slid it back into the cloth. There will be meetings, she said. There will be signatures and a bell for names buried under your story. Men looked at each other, then at the shaft mouth, then at the boots that had marched through rituals and never into records. Two drifted toward town, shoulders squaring as if carrying something finally named. Another helped the clubman stand. The dog nosed the broken cane, sneezed and trotted to Clara's knee. Silas stared at the ring once more, eyes reflecting only his own face. He opened his mouth, closed it and let out a breath like a sermon ending without an aim. Clara and Amos mounted. The mare stepped lightly over rail and stone. Behind them the shaft breathed again. Not curse, only vacant space remembering strain. They rode down slope with the ledger wrapped safe, wind flattening sage. The town beyond the flats waiting for words avoided for years. Clara glanced back at the mouth and then at the ridge, feeling resolve settle like a true horizon. Amos tipped his hat against the sun and kept the pace steady. No bullets followed, no chant rose, only creaking leather, rhythmic hoofbeats and the thin ring of cooling rail told the valley that one story had cracked and another, plainer, had finally found air. Truth had finally found open daylight. At dusk they reached the cabin ridge, sage lying flat, under a newly gentle wind that carried cool breath from the higher snowfields. The valley below holding only a faint hush where rumor had lived. Amos dismounted, tied the mare and crouched by the stone fire ring. He shaved cedar curls, laid dry twigs, struck a match, and fed breath until a steady tongue of flame licked the kindling. Smoke rose in a thin blue line, turning the air clean with resin and ash. Clara set the ledger on the table by the door, then stood with a small tin that held the copper ring cushioned in cloth, the lid cold as creek stone. She said the town would need a moment it could not reinterpret. He nodded and pointed to the fire bed. The dog trotted from the porch, and lay near the threshold, one ear forward, the other flopped, watching without sound. Juniper branches clicked softly above the eaves. Distant crows crossed the sky like ink strokes dragged by a careful hand. The light faded toward indigo, the ridge kept its outline, lanterns in the flats winked and stilled. Silas Kane came up the last stretch of the track with two men behind him, steps slow, coat dusty, eyes not hostile but emptied of the certainty that had carried him through years of sermon. He stopped outside the circle of stones and looked at the ring, not at Clara. The men set down their rifles and backed away without orders, as though fatigue had finally grown heavier than obedience. Silas asked what this would prove. Amos answered that nothing needed proving to fire. The proof was for people, and people would stand here tomorrow with the pages, and see what survived the heat. Clara said symbols cut both ways, one had been used to harm and another could be used to end harm. She opened the tin, lifted the copper, and laid it on a flat stone at the fire's edge. She did not hurry, her hands shook once, then steadied. The metal looked small in the gathering dark, not mystical, not grand, only human and particular. She said the ring had belonged to a child, and the town had taken that child's memory hostage. Amos did not add a word, The wind shifted and pressed warmth into their faces. Sparks climbed and faded, small planets finding no orbit. Beyond the yard, wheat rustled against itself with a low, patient music. The air smelled like leather, smoke and a sweetness that comes when cedar begins to char. Amos broke a dry branch, fed the bed of coals and gestured. Clara stepped closer, the heat touching her face and hands. She held the copper in her palm and felt only the weight and the faint memory of skin warmed by work. She told the wind, the ridge and the man who had blessed the lie that the circle in her hand would stop carrying fear tonight. She asked quietly for names to keep breathing, where breath belonged on paper at tables, in meetings where signatures would learn to stand up without disguises. She lowered the ring onto the stone, the dog raised its head and watched. Silas lifted his chin and said the town had needed a banner when men died. Grief without a banner destroys homes. Clara answered that grief without truth destroys more. Amos added that a banner built from avoidance, tears when the first new wind arrives. And what remains is only the weight that should have been shared honestly. The dog lay by the door with its head on its paws, watching. The mare shifted, girth creaking quietly. Sage breathed its clean bitterness. The ridge held a last band of copper sunset, that had nothing to do with metal and everything to do with time. Silas lowered his cane until its tip touched gravel. He said a story must bind people, or they drift. Amos said a community does not need a story that eats its children. Clara took a coal with the poker and pressed heat under the ring until it brightened, the surface first dull red, then cherry, then orange near the thin edge. She did not look away. She thought of a porch, a ribbon, a small hand that never reached the next morning, and the way a town had called that absence a gate for curses rather than the wound of poor timber and hurried in. She slid the ring from the stone into the center of the flame, and let it lie there like a small sun swallowed by a larger mouth. The fire answered with a soft growl, not violent, simply serious. Silas exhaled and stepped back until the stones touched his boot. He said nothing. The two men who had walked with him turned toward the slope. One paused and removed his hat, the other traced a brief cross over his chest, then dropped his hand as if choosing a different habit. Amos stood on the far side of the ring so Clara could see him through heat and smoke, a figure shaped by stubborn patience. She watched the metal slump, then settle. The fire did not roar, it hummed the low song of steady labor. When she spoke, her voice did not reach for drama. She said an object cannot argue, and so people must argue for it until lies run out of air. She asked Silas what he would let go now that no story lived inside the circle. He looked at the flame and said a man should not be required to confess the way a map should be drawn. Then his shoulders loosened, and the angle of his mouth gave up the performance that had kept him moving. He told Amos the sermon book would be set down for others to examine. He told Clara he had no more lanterns to light on that field. He turned and walked toward the track, not hurrying, not grand, simply smaller than he had been. They waited until the metal dimmed and the flames settled back into the small valley between stones. Amos fetched a bucket, doused the edge and cooled a path for her feet. Clara stepped around, knelt and looked into the bed where bright had become ordinary again. She did not retrieve the lump. Leaving it there felt right, not as litter but as a marker that did not need a fence or a sermon to stand. She rose slowly. She turned to Silas. She asked whether he would walk away without inventing another veil. He paused on the track and nodded once, a motion nearly invisible in the lowering light. Then he kept going down, his cane tapping gravel with a stripped rhythm. Amos watched until the coat vanished behind juniper and then looked at Clara with the kind of relief that does not smile, only breathe. He invited her inside, where the stove kept a low glow and the table waited with the ledger and the photographs of the pages she had made at dawn. The room smelled of smoke, oil, coffee ground earlier, leather worn by rains and time. He poured water and set a tin cup at her plate. He did not sit until her hand steadied. When he finally lowered himself into the chair, the weight looked like a piece of winter lifting off a roof. He told her about the morning the blast came. He described a ribbon that would not lie flat, a laugh that had learned to echo in rafters, a small finger tapping a rhythm on the table while he tied boots. He said he had promised a ride at dusk, and had come home alone to a sky that would not turn any color but gray. He said he had spoken into the quiet until words wore thin and the quiet did not. He said he had wanted to take the hill apart with his hands and had settled for rebuilding fences, because repetition can keep breath moving, when grief refuses. He did not cry when he spoke the name. He looked at the ledger instead, as if the book could bear some part of the weight at last. Clara listened without interruption. She pictured a porch with morning dust, a dress that needed hemming, a bowl set to proof beside a window, and the way a house holds laughter after laughter. She thought of the ledger and the split board under the clerk's chair, of an inspector who had written a warning and vanished, of a congregation that had been shown a story shaped to cover a balance sheet. She thought of herself stepping from the coach into eyes trained to see an omen before they saw a traveler. She felt anger and then something steadier than anger, commitment. She asked him gently whether he would tell that story in the square when the bell rang. He said yes. He said the bell would not be for doom, it would be for names. Amos asked whether burning the ring felt like losing part of her mother. She said no, what she kept was not metal, what she kept lived in the questions that had carried her across states and in the stubborn thread that refused to accept fog when daylight was possible. She said the burn had not erased memory, it had removed a mask so memory could breathe. He nodded, thumb worrying the edge of the tin until the lid clicked shut. The dog thumped its tail once under the table, as if agreeing that breath mattered. Outside, the fire settled into coals. Stars came in without ceremony, steady and countless, the cold above enormous and clear. Wind worried the juniper, and then moved on. The cabin felt larger, the valley did not. They spoke about next steps with the same tone used for chores, because work done right does not need drums. In the morning, letters would be pinned to doors inviting people to hear names. Ledgers would be copied and placed where hands could touch them without asking permission. The square would be swept, the bell rope would be repaired. A table would hold water, ink and a register, witness would be given a Amos shared a short story that had lived behind his ribs like a small stone. He told her how his daughter had once tried to teach a stubborn colt to accept a saddle by standing beside it for an hour, speaking in a low tone until fear got bored and walked away. He said that memory had kept him alive on nights when anger tried to take the lines. He never got to give her the copper band because she fell asleep that last afternoon with it on a string, and then the string lay on a shelf while the town taught itself to kneel to smoke. He said the burn felt like closing a door gently, not slamming it, so a quiet room could exist in a house that still had weather. Clara reached across the ledger and put her hand over his. She did not promise healing, she did not say pain would fade. She said work had arrived, and they would share it. She said meetings would be held on the porch so no door could be closed against a widow. She said copies would be posted where children could read them and ask better questions than their parents had been given. She asked him, in a voice only slightly above a whisper, what would you let go to find peace? The question did not push, it opened. He looked at their hands, then at the door where the night waited with stars rather than doctrine. He answered that he would let go of the belief that penance must be private to be real. He said he would let go of the urge to ride the long breaks alone. He said he would stand in the square when the bell rang, and read names that had been kept under flowers. He said he would walk to porches that had looked away and invite them to stay present while truth spoke. He said he would stop calling the mind by the nickname men had used to pretend it was a friend. Clara breathed, feeling ash cool on her skin, and asked herself what weight she could release to let peace live. Amos answered with silence that felt like shelter. Fire settled, stars gathered, and the valley seemed to listen. Tomorrow would carry records, tonight would carry They kept watch together a while. Sun rose clean over Nevada's fields as frost let go of its pale lace and the hush that had ruled the flats unwound into living sounds, creaking leather, even hoofbeats. Birds sketching brief shadows on wheat that finally moved like water instead of a held breath. Clara rode beside Amos along the ridge cut, posture easy, wrists bandaged in fresh linen where rope had once carved memory, gaze steady, mouth set in a line that meant labor rather than fear. The mare chose certain footing through shale ribs, ears flicking toward a creek that carried faint music under thaw. Down in dry willow, windows opened on air that smelled like juniper and distant smoke without the old bitterness. Doors stood ajar while sweepers pushed last night's ash into tidy pans. Not out of dread, simply because morning asks for order. The splintered cross on the rise had been pulled and stacked against a fence. Its wood would heat a widow's stove before sundown. The bell rope dangled newly spliced. On the porch of the clerk's office, a plank lifted easily where a thumbnail caught a folded sheet lay in the light. No longer hidden, Names clear, dates unblotted. Clara touched the satchel that held 2 photographs of ledger pages, the inspector's slip and a list of signatures gathered at dawn. Amos tipped his hat to a boy who stood at the lane with a broom and a grin that did not apologize for hope. Sun warmed the ridge gravel. Coyotes crossed in pairs, not wary, just moving places along their old line. A quilt hung from a rail near the mercantile, stitched squares flashing a seam where a widow had once hidden a record. Now the folded strip lay pinned above it, open for any hand to trace. Clara breathed, tasting clean dust that promised work. She and Amos turned their horses toward the extended flats, and let the pace settle into a rhythm that felt like a vow. They did not hurry. They did not dawdle. They kept a line that could carry letters, errands, and testimony without drama. The cabin roof behind them caught a new shine where soot had been brushed away. Near the yard, a stone ring cooled around a dimmed lump of copper, settled into ash, not sacred, not shunned, simply spent. Clara glanced back once, not to second guess, only to mark a finished chapter. She had feared that burning would steal something private. It had not. Memory remained, lighter now that it did not carry a town's borrowed weight. Amos watched the line of her jaw and saw the steadiness that had entered overnight and believed it would remain when crowds grew noisy again. At the church, Silas Kane sat on the steps with a box of ledgers and a face stripped of theater. He spoke softly to a seamstress who had come with needlework lists, then rose to offer a book to the blacksmith, then sat again, smaller still, present. No one cheered, no one hit. People listened as though they all shared the same fragile instrument and had agreed not to drown it. The deacon carried a tin of oil toward the stable, not to pour circles but to mend a squealing hymn. A hymn floated out of a kitchen window and found a key that sounded like gratitude rather than defense. Clara and Amos passed without stopping because passages work only when people move through them. They aimed for a far fence where cedar posts leaned and wire sagged. A job worth doing that would keep their hands honest until the bell called names. Sage breathed clean bitterness across open ground. A hawk stood on the wind above a swale and tipped one feather like a compass needle. Correct. The mine mouth, a black seam in the hillside, held quiet that felt like a held story ready to be told in straight lines. A new sign had been hammered into the roadbed by dawn riders. Site closed pending review by county and state. The letters looked firm enough to face the weather. Clara lifted her chin and felt a warmth in her throat that was not pride and not sorrow. Something like a river finding its bed again. She said they would meet every afternoon for a week, open book by book, stitch by stitch, and let questions take air. Amos agreed, and added that they would write down who spoke, who helped, and who needed food because truth without bread bends under hunger. The dog trotted behind the mare with a twig in its mouth like a trophy, tail giving a slow metronome to the morning. A wagon rolled up from the south road with sacks of flour and letters tied under the driver's seat, dust streaming from hubs like thin banners. Behind it came a cart with posts in a coil of wire that glinted. Work travels well with sunlight. Clara thought of her first step off the coach. The hush, the pointing finger, the cold press of the ring. She let those pieces settle into place without spikes to hold them there. They would involve a judge when copies had been made, but they would begin with listening because a town that forgets how to listen grows brittle. The ridge widened and fell away until the valley opened like a page. Margins clean, story legible. Snow remained on the high teeth to the west, dazzling under late light, sending slow cold into the afternoon so the floor did not overheat. Amos told her he would stand under the bell and read his child's name without looking down. He had practiced all morning by mending a strap, saying the name on every stitch until the sound stayed steady. Clara told him she would answer hard questions and ask harder ones in return. She would not humiliate. She would not soften numbers. She would seek repair over spectacle and still carry the line to court if obstruction returned. They crossed a shallow ford where water held a green tint over stone. Hooves made clean sounds. A frog flicked from a muddy lip and vanished. Everything small continued with its own business because the morning had made space for it. Behind them smoke rose from 3 chimneys only, thin, practical, blue. The field where lanterns had once cast eerie ovals, now looked like a place for games or harvest lines. A pair of children jogged its edge, kicking a tin, laughter hanging in the air without apology. A woman with a ledger stood under a cottonwood tree, writing as a neighbor recited day. No one whispered a curse. Words such as brace, contract, invoice, and shipment moved through open air and did not feel like accusations. They felt like tools. Clara smiled at that and let the smile fade, so it would not harden into a posture. She and Amos reached the far fence, and looped the reins. Wire sang as they drew it taut, pliers clicked, knots took staples bit, work talked to bone and made peace with thought. They set 3 posts true and stepped back to watch the line run clean under the sunlight. The dog buried its twig and looked proud. When the bell finally spoke, clear and plain, it did not toll grief. It named the sound, ran out across wheat, reached the mine road, climbed the hill and returned softer, as if the valley had said yes. They mounted again and turned toward the square at an easy trot. People gathered, widows, haulers, cartboys, shopkeepers, riders with dust masks slung loose, travelers who had chosen to stay a day longer because the air felt different. A table held water, paper, ink, bread, a jar of coins and a basket of nails because repairs always begin nearby. Silas stood, looked at the ground, then raised his eyes and nodded once to Amos before stepping aside. The deacon held a chair and did not speak first. Clara climbed the 3 steps and faced the crowd with no ring on her finger and no ash on her cheek. Only Amos took the ledger from the satchel and set it beside the register. He told a plain version of last night and this morning, then said the names. He did not falter. He did not add thunder. People listened and were not shattered. They were steady. After the reading, hands went up, not to accuse, to volunteer, copying, sweeping, cooking, riding to distant ranches with notices, sitting with an old man who had started shaking when the first brace failed and had never stopped. Clara closed the book and felt the day open in front of them like a broad road unrolled. She and Amos stepped down together. The dog wove and settled at their boots. They mounted once more and moved through the lane, while neighbors returned to ordinary things with uncommon care. The sun sat higher, brightness clean, wind mild, wheat ready to sleep and rise, not to panic. Past felt lighter, not erased, carried proper. The land felt alive, not cursed, and the road ahead held turns that would ask for courage again. Court dates, town votes, winter storms, rough miles and days when discouragement would try to borrow a bed. They would meet each one as it arrived with work, compassion and records that no longer hid under flour. If Clara and Amos's journey moved you, like, share and subscribe to catch the next story of hope rising from ashes.